Okay, so you get hip flexor pain while squatting, or you get just general hip pain in the front of your hip whenever you do squats. Well, in this video, we're gonna talk about what you can do to fix that. I'm gonna explain a couple exercises you can do and explain why massage and stretching may not be the best thing, especially if you've been doing them a lot already to try to fix your hip flexor pain. As always, I want to remind you that you don't want to get caught in RIIPS. Rest, ice, injections, pills, surgery, not a good idea. ATM is where we want to go. We want to always think muscles. So we want to train the muscles to do what they need to do to be able to squat comfortably. So if you're getting hip flexor pain, you may have already thought about doing massage. You may have already been doing a lot of hip flexor stretching, a lot of quad stretching on the couch. You may have used the kettlebell to just smash into your hip flexor, and you found that, hey, it's not doing anything. If anything, it might be making it worse. So the thing to remember here is that massage and stretching can be really useful for some people, sometimes if they're getting discomfort in the front of their hip while squatting. But if you've already been trying those things and they're not really working, your range of motion is actually pretty good, but you just can't seem to make any progress on this, then you want to be thinking about building strength at every length. This is a very important concept to understand. I'm going to link to an article in the description box so you can read up on this. But basically, you cannot just assume that tightness always means you need to relax the muscle. Instead, when you're going into a squat, if you've already been doing all this relaxing and all this smashing and all this stretching, and you still feel like there's something hurting in your hip flexors, then you want to start to think about strength. You probably lack strength to control that position, and the muscles there are complaining. So what you can do instead is start training that strength by simply grabbing some ankle weights. And I'm going to show you two exercises that are going to really get at your hip flexors. So I mentioned we want to build strength at every length. So first, we're going to start building some strength in a shortened position, meaning these hip flexors in their shortest position. So here they have maximum resistance against the weight when they're at their shortest position. I'm gonna just slowly be lifting this ankle weight up, holding this top position for 3 to 5 seconds, and then slowly back down. The goal is to keep bringing this sucker higher using these hip muscles. If you can't do it with just the hip muscles, grab it with your hand, pull it up, and then hold it up there so you feel those muscles working, screaming, and cramping. If you've never done any hip flexor exercises, which most of us haven't, then you're gonna feel this pretty strongly. Obviously, you wanna do both sides, but if you have one side that is weaker than the other, one side that tends to be more pinchy and jammy than the other, do an extra set for that side. When you're first doing this, start with sets of 5, work your way up to sets of up to even 20, and do 2 sets. So you could do 2 sets of 5 to begin with, and then keep working until you can get to 2 sets of 20 on each leg with an extra set for your weaker side. Doing that 2 days a week is probably a good place to start, and then you can bump it up to 4 days a week, or maybe possibly even every single day, depending on what your life looks like, your lifestyle looks like, and your ability to recover. You can also use different angles, meaning abducting more to more closely approximate your squat. If you tend to have a narrow squat and that's where the jamming happens, it may be a good idea to just keep it narrow. If you have a wider squat and that's where the jamming happens, then maybe you want to be working on that. Explore, find where you're weak in your hip flexors, and then build that short range hip flexor strength. Now, what about strength at a long length? Well, then we can grab a bench or a plyo box or a couch even, and you can just lie down. You're gonna take one leg, hug it to your chest, the other leg, you're getting into extension. So you're getting hip extension, you're stretching out those hip flexors of this leg. It's kind of like a Thomas test. You keep your abs on, try to keep the low back nice and flat, so it's as much hip extension as you can get, and then you're gonna lift up towards the ceiling, and going to right around 45 to 60 degrees is probably all you need to do. You could go all the way up, but with the ankle weight especially, once you get past a certain point, you're basically just getting a hamstring stretch, which is fine. You're just not getting as much work in the hip flexors, and the whole reason we're doing this particular setup is to get the hip flexors to work at a lengthened position. So you can just stop it short around 45-ish degrees. That's where you're probably gonna stop feeling the hip flexor work. And then you're just going nice and slow and controlled, feeling that stretch and the work as you bring it back up. Okay, so you should feel that right there on the top of the thigh. That's going to really strengthen the hip flexors at a lengthened position, which will then have carryover when you go to squat, and your hip flexors need to be strong, well-developed, and functional. Just like the previous exercise, you want to make sure you do both sides. If you have a weaker side, then make sure to do an extra set for the weaker sides. Start with a set of 5 repetitions, do 2 sets for each side with an extra set for the weaker side, and then do that 2 days a week and see if you can do it more, if that feels like a benefit, and if it feels like it's good for your body and that you could recover from it appropriately. Just like with the other exercise, you can also experiment with leg position. So you could, for example, go more abducted and then see how much hip extension you get. It's a really eye-opening experience to play around with angles, and you try to untangle every angle and build strength at every single length. Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking, well, oh man, how did I get weak hip flexors? They're super tight. They must be getting work from all my squatting and deadlifting or my playing tennis and running or whatever. The thing you want to remember is that unless you are really directly training certain muscles, they're not going to get worked in your normal activities or your daily life. Squatting and deadlifting involve the hip flexors, but they don't really directly target your hip flexors. You cannot and should not expect compound exercises to target your hip muscles properly. If you're getting hip flexor pain while squatting, you have to realize that the hip flexors are probably not working that well, and maybe other hip muscles are not working that well too. Compound lifts like the squat and deadlift target a bunch of muscles, but there are some key primary muscles in those exercises. The training stimulus you get for your thighs and your butt and your hamstrings is much higher than what you get for your hip flexors when you're doing squatting and deadlifting. As you're working to fix your hip flexor pain while squatting, you want to start incorporating and exploring new hip exercises that build your hip mobility and hip strength in multiple directions and positions. Remember that muscles can feel tight and jammy even if they're weak, and especially if they're too weak. So when you feel your hip flexor pain while you're squatting, you feel any other hip muscle bugging you, and you realize it's a muscle you almost never do any targeted work for, it might be time to start targeting that hip muscle. If you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, like how am I going to discover all these different hip exercises? What am I supposed to do? I don't understand what this guy is talking about. Then I encourage you to check out the Healthy Hips program. I'll drop a link down below in the description box. And if you've been told that your hip pain is from FAI or hip impingement, again, don't get caught in RIIPS, always think muscles, and check out the FAI fix, which I'll have a link to down below. Make sure to karate kick that like button, side kick that subscribe button, elbow that bell notification icon, and share this with somebody you know who's got problems with hip pain while squatting. I'm Matt Shu from Upright Health, reminding you that pain sucks, life shouldn't.